Hello, we're Team D, Jaywalks, and this is our presentation for supply chain and business disruption, the case for the COVID-19 pandemic. So with the index, this is what we're going to be going through today. We're going to be talking about what is COVID-19. We're going to be discussing the beginning interruptions to the supply chain, as well as the global level interruptions. We're going to be discussing it on a couple different implications, trade implications, economic implications, supply chain implications, and big and small business and consumer behavior.
First, we're going to start off with what is COVID-19. It's a new infectious disease. It can affect your lungs and your airways. It's a zoononic disease. So that means it's spread from animals to humans. So some other examples include like rabies, and it's really scaring consumers right now because it hasn't been seen in humans before, so they don't really know how to react. It spreads from person to person, so it can spread either by cough droplets or by touching other surfaces that have been contaminated by someone who carries the disease. Some symptoms of the disease can include cough, fever, shortness of breath, and it's really starting to have an impact on the global economy. So it first began in Wuhan, China. It began with China shutting down a lot of their factories. A lot of their workers couldn't go back to work after their Chinese New Year. It also started to lead to different travel restrictions, and it does have an impact on both supply and demand. Countries started to see a shortage in supplies, but it also had a big impact on consumer behavior. So it did begin in China, but it quickly started spreading to all around the world, from Italy to different parts of Europe, and now it's very heavily in the US. So given that there has been a reduction in the workforce, there's been a scarcity of the most essential items and resources that we need, such as toiletries, medicine, food. It's become much more essential during these times. And the global fear of the virus is impacting the global economy because, like I said before, it really hasn't been seen before in humans. So they're not sure how to react, and they're not sure what steps to take to best minimize the risk. And what we can expect to see is a significant downturn in the economy. One example that it would be similar to would be the economic recession of 2008.
So then for the global trade implications, COVID-19 has had an unprecedented disruption to the global economy and world trade, according to the World Trade Organization. The director of the WTO, he noted that the pandemic has caused dramatic supply and demand shocks in the world economy, and this is causing the major disruptions to trade. This is because a lot of businesses were forced to shut down due to mandatory city closures and quarantines, as well as consumers were stuck inside due to a lot of shelter-at-home orders, which is causing the supply and demand shocks. The WTO's Their Goods and Services Trade Barometer, which was issued both on February 17th and March 11th. Both these reports pointed to a continued weakening of world trade in both sectors and the likelihood of further declines in the coming months as the full economic impact of the COVID-19 virus becomes more apparent, because right now we're still unsure of the final impacts that it will have on global trade, but all the trends are pointing to a significant decrease in global trade because of it. A real life example of trade being disrupted is between China and the US. Beginning in January of 2020, these two nations, they finalized phase 1 of a trade deal, which was meant to end the 2-year war between China and the US. However, following the deal, the coronavirus began to spread throughout China. This caused businesses to shut down, which heavily strained consumption, and it also significantly decreased manufacturing productivity and exports due to the quarantines and city closures mentioned earlier. And then we were seeing in January to February that China's exports had collapsed by 17.2%, and they also reported a trade deficit of 7.1 billion, which was the largest they've had since March of 2018. And so then from this pandemic and the current contraction, this has called into question whether or not that China will be able to meet the phase 1 agreement of 77 billion trade of goods from the US. And then also due to this shutdown and stay-at-home orders, it's also questioned if the US will even be able to supply the agreed upon goods. And these goods included agricultural goods, energy services, as well as manufactured goods. Greg Gilligan, he's the chairman of AmCham China, and he believes that the additional 77 billion in trade between these two nations will be unlikely because of COVID-19 and the trade disruptions that we are seeing. Additionally, China's imports from the US have grown by 2.5%, which is good. However, given the first start of the year, their exports have dropped by 27.7%, and this is according to Chinese customs data. So moving on to economic implications. These are currently still unknown. This is due to the uncertainty surrounding how long the coronavirus will be around. However, economists are theorizing the impact will be large on the economy. The extent of the damage will depend heavily on how quickly the virus is contained, what steps authorities begin to take to contain it, and how much economic support governments are willing to give during this time, during the pandemic. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, they have predicted that COVID-19 will lower the global GDP by 0.5 percentage point from 2.9 to 2.4% in 2020. While there's still uncertainty surrounding what the true economic impact will be, economists have begun theorizing potential economic recessions and recoveries that the coronavirus may have on the economy. The first is being a V-shape, which is seen in the first graph, which is a sharp but brief period of economic decline, which is then followed by a quick recovery. This is the most optimistic. And then a U-shape, which is the middle graph, which is a gradual decline followed by a recovery that begins slowly, however, it quickly gains momentum. And then the last graph we see an L-shape, which is a steep decline in economic growth and a slow recovery. This is the most drastic and dire of predictions. Economists are hopeful that the recovery will take the form of a V or a U-shape. This is because once shelter-at-home orders and social distancing sanctions are lifted, businesses will be able to begin producing and manufacturing at the levels that we saw pre-pandemic. And so then what does this all mean for the supply chains? COVID-19 has had an unprecedented impact on these. Companies that once heavily relied on the limited number of trading partners, they're now facing huge challenges after these quarantines and city closures. In a survey done by the Institute of Supply Chain Management, nearly 75% of companies had already been reporting supply chain disruptions due to COVID-19, and now 80% believe that they will have some disruptions because of the virus in the future. For many businesses, what this means is that lead times have increased, and they also are experiencing a shortage of transportation options to move product to the US. Many of these disruptions occurred due to current supply chain trends, which include minimizing costs, reducing inventory, and driving up asset utilization. These trends have removed buffers and flexibility to be able to adapt to these major disruptions. And then finally, because of COVID-19, we're seeing that the supply chain industry will have to change in the future to be able to adapt to these disruptions. Companies that had invested in mapping their supply chain networks and knowing where their suppliers were from were better prepared for the pandemic. Because they had more information on their supply chains and exactly which suppliers, sites, parts, and producers were at risk, this allowed them to be able to secure inventory and capacity at alternative sites. And then moving forward in the future, experts now predict that they'll see a sharp reversal in supply chains, and they'll see a reversal in supply chains as companies look to mitigate risk and localize their supply chains, particularly among technology firms and pharmaceuticals. And then finally, companies may look to diversify their strategy to when it comes to sourcing their supply chains.
So some effects we're seeing in big business is businesses are shutting down to the pandemic, such as Apple and Nike. We see that businesses are also looking at government bailouts, such as the airline industry, who currently and have received $50 billion as a bailout, half of which are grants. And what that means is they won't be having to pay back the government for that. The biggest hit is to tourism worldwide, with nations shutting down airports. So these shutdowns are affecting the supply chain because manufacturers and distributors, they're not able to operate, which is also affecting payroll of employees. Eventually the supply does go down and demand will be high. This affects the price of products as well, such as toilet paper, hand sanitizer, or other household cleaning items that we're seeing being hit right now. As well as big businesses, the biggest hit is into small businesses right now. We're seeing a higher impact on small businesses due to the coronavirus. We're seeing it hit family-owned stores and restaurant and bars. States across the country, have put a shutdown in place of all dine-in establishments and bars. So those are really affecting employees, owners that have to pay rent for the buildings that they own. They have had to adapt by adding delivery service or a curbside pickup option, but this is still not covering the costs needed to pay employees that have been either laid off or have been sent home early, or the rent that they need to be covering. To combat this, the Federal Reserve slashed the interest rate to zero as part of a wide-ranging emergency intervention. This allows for banks to offer more generous loans and for businesses to take one if they are in need of a lifeline. So we're seeing the consumer behavior constantly change due to COVID-19. So e-commerce has soared as consumers are staying inside and away from stores. Consumers are especially using delivery services for groceries. So we see more people taking social distancing to the extreme and are minimizing their contact as much as they can. And by using e-commerce, that way they are able to do that and maintain their quarantine. We're also seeing a lot of stock up and buy in bulk consumers more than ever. This is hitting the supply or Amazon and stores such as Costco. The demand is high, the supply is low. And if you see here, if you take a look at this chart, it collected data from consumers themselves and how it affected their shopping behavior. 20% are shopping in stores. They wouldn't stop otherwise. 25% are buying products. 28% are making online purchases when they usually shop up in the store. 53% of them are stocking up on products, which they usually don't buy. And 73 experience product shortages at stores that they are trying to buy from. So obviously the stores aren't able to keep up with the demand right now. The supply is very limited, and they're moving on to looking at products online. And even those even the supply online is low. And here's our works cited.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.